There is a reason this week may feel strangely different from anything you have experienced recently. And I want you to pay close attention to that feeling, because what is unfolding now may force you to confront something you have been avoiding without even realizing it. If your emotions have felt unusually heavy, if your thoughts seem scattered, or if you've been carrying a quiet sense that something is approaching, even though you cannot identify what it is, do not dismiss that experience too quickly. There is a very specific astrological pattern behind the atmosphere surrounding you right now, and it is much deeper than a temporary change in mood. Today, Monday, August 17th, Mars forms an exact square to Neptune. And while that may initially sound like another technical movement in the sky, this particular alignment reaches into something much more personal. It can challenge the assumptions you have built your life around, especially the assumptions you rarely stop to question. Think about the career direction you have continued pursuing because you convinced yourself that you had already invested too much to turn back. Think about the relationship you keep defending because admitting that something has changed would force you to feel emotions you would rather avoid. Think about the identity you have created for other people, the version of yourself you have learned to display because it receives approval, stability, or acceptance. Mars Square. Neptune can bring pressure to those very areas when the foundation underneath them is based on illusion rather than reality. It is almost as though a light begins moving through a room you have kept dim for a very long time, revealing shapes that were always there, but that you are not ready to recognize. If something in your life depends upon a story that cannot survive contact with reality, that story may begin to weaken now. And what makes this especially important is that you are not necessarily waiting for this energy to arrive. You may already have been experiencing its effects for several days, perhaps even longer, without knowing how to connect the dots. That unexplained pressure in your chest, the mental haze that makes simple decisions feel strangely difficult. The feeling that something important is moving beneath the surface while remaining impossible to name. These experiences may have made you wonder whether you were simply tired, overwhelmed, or emotionally out of balance. But this is precisely why I want you to stay with the larger picture. What you are feeling did not suddenly appear today. The present moment is part of a sequence that has been developing throughout August, and understanding that sequence changes the way you interpret everything happening inside you. There is also one particular physical symptom that many people may notice around this transit, and it is something that receives very little attention when people discuss this kind of astrological pressure. I will return to that later, because understanding the larger build-up first is important. Mars Square. Neptune is not operating as an isolated event. Today represents the culmination of several movements that have been gradually increasing the tension, and once you recognize what has happened since the beginning of August, the emotional atmosphere of the past 2 weeks can begin to look far less mysterious. The first major piece appeared on August 10th, when Venus in Libra formed an exact opposition to Neptune. Venus governs love, relationships, beauty, finances, and the areas of life where we place emotional value and personal meaning. Neptune, by contrast, can blur boundaries between what we hope is true and what is actually true. When these energies confronted one another, the emotional picture could become difficult to read. Someone you had placed on a pedestal might suddenly appear more human and more complicated. A financial expectation that once seemed dependable could begin to feel uncertain. A partnership you considered secure could reveal details that had somehow remained outside your attention. The important point is that the confusion does not always originate with another person. Sometimes, the most uncomfortable discovery is recognizing the story you created for yourself. You may have been protecting an image because the image gave you comfort. You may have chosen the interpretation that allowed you to keep believing everything would eventually become exactly what you wanted it to be. You may have noticed warning signs and then explained them away because accepting their meaning would have required a difficult decision. That is not the same thing as intentionally lying to yourself. Often, self-deception begins as self-protection. We create a softer version of reality because the truth feels too painful, too uncertain, or too disruptive to face all at once. You might tell yourself that someone will eventually change, that a situation only needs more time, that your current path is temporary, or that your dissatisfaction is simply exhaustion. The fantasy can feel safer than the truth, because the fantasy allows you to postpone the moment when you have to choose. Yet this is exactly why this period can become such a powerful moment of awakening. When illusion begins to dissolve, the first feeling is not always relief. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is anger. Sometimes it is embarrassment, because you realize how long you have been defending something that was never as solid as you believed. But that realization does not mean you failed. It means your awareness has caught up with what your deeper self may have already sensed. You are not foolish for wanting something to be real. You are human for believing in the possibility of a better outcome. What changes now is that this energy makes it increasingly difficult to maintain a comforting story when reality keeps presenting you with evidence that asks you to look again. Then, only one day later, another major shift changed the emotional landscape even further. On August 11th, Mars moved into Cancer. This matters because Mars represents action, determination, instinct, confrontation, aggression, and the impulse to move forward when something stands in your way. Mars normally wants direct movement. It wants to act, compete, defend, pursue, and overcome. But when Mars moves through Cancer, that drive becomes deeply connected to emotional security. Instead of simply asking what you want to accomplish, your instincts become entangled with the need to protect yourself, your home, your family, your memories, and the people you feel emotionally responsible for. This can make conflict far more complicated, because the reaction is no longer only about what is happening in the present moment. Something small can activate something much older. A short message can suddenly feel colder than it actually was. A facial expression can be interpreted as rejection. A conversation that seemed ordinary to someone else can touch an emotional wound that has been sitting quietly inside you for years. Your nervous system may respond before your conscious mind has had the chance to understand what happened. You may feel the urge to retreat, defend yourself, become silent, build emotional walls, or prepare for an attack that may not actually be coming. This is where the Mars in Cancer influence becomes difficult to navigate. The instinct to protect yourself is real, but the perceived danger is not always real. Sometimes your body remembers a previous experience and reacts as though the old situation is happening again. You may think you are responding to a person in front of you when you are actually responding to a memory that person accidentally awakened. You may believe you are defending your boundaries when part of you is actually defending an old wound. You may become convinced that someone is against you when the deeper issue is that you are afraid of being hurt again. If you have felt unusually reactive during this past week, pause before deciding that every emotional signal is a factual message. Ask yourself what belongs to the present and what may have been carried forward from the past. I can recognize this pattern in myself as well, because this kind of energy can make even emotionally aware people question their own reactions. And this is where the larger sequence becomes even more significant. The eclipse had already weakened the old foundation, making hidden emotional material easier to access. And then, in the middle of this build-up, August 12th brought a total solar eclipse in Leo. The timing creates another layer to the story, because an eclipse is not experienced merely as an abstract symbol. It can become a moment when something previously operating in the background suddenly demands attention. This was a massive eclipse, and its physical visibility reflected the intensity of the event itself. The path of totality crossed Iceland, Greenland, and parts of northern Spain, while millions of people experienced complete daytime darkness for over 2 minutes. Imagine standing in the middle of the day and watching daylight disappear, even temporarily. That image captures something about the emotional symbolism of this period. What you assumed would remain visible can suddenly become obscured, while what was hidden begins demanding your attention. The eclipse in Leo brings the question of identity into sharper focus, especially the difference between who you genuinely are and the person you have learned to become for recognition, approval, affection, or security. When the outer light changes, the inner story can become easier to see. That is why the strange feelings you have been carrying may not be meaningless discomfort. They may be part of a larger process in which one layer after another is being exposed, first through Venus and Neptune, then through Mars entering Cancer, and then through the total solar eclipse in Leo. Each event has contributed another piece to the same emotional progression, bringing you closer to the exact Mars-Neptune Square happening today. So if you have been asking yourself why your emotions feel heavier, why certain people or situations suddenly seem different, or why the life you were comfortable accepting no longer feels quite as convincing, look carefully at what has been unfolding rather than judging yourself for feeling unsettled. The deeper purpose of this moment is not simply to create confusion. It is to make the difference between emotional fear and actual truth harder to ignore. And as this sequence reaches the Mars-Neptune Square, the pressure moves toward an even more personal point, where the fog itself may begin revealing exactly what it has been hiding. What if the eclipse was not simply something beautiful to witness in the sky, but a moment that quietly changed the way you see yourself? And what if the uncomfortable feelings that followed are actually part of that change? I want you to think back to how you felt after the eclipse, because the emotional shift may have been much more important than the astronomical spectacle itself. A total solar eclipse in Leo carries a powerful symbolic message about identity, pride, self-expression, recognition, and the image you carry into the world. Leo is connected with the self, with the part of you that wants to be seen, appreciated, admired, and recognized for what you bring into the world. When a solar eclipse moves through Leo, it can feel as though the light that normally shines on your identity is temporarily dimmed, leaving you alone with a question that is much harder to avoid than most people realize. Who are you when there is no audience? Who are you when nobody is praising you? Who are you when the approval disappears and you cannot measure your worth through another person's reaction? That question can reach places inside you that have been protected for years. You may have built confidence around accomplishments, attention, appearance, status, romantic attention, professional success, or the approval of people whose opinions matter deeply to you. But what happens when those external signals become quiet? What remains when nobody is watching? That is where the eclipse begins to expose the difference between genuine self-belief and a carefully maintained performance. You might discover that something you called confidence was actually the need to prove yourself. You might recognize that a goal you have chased relentlessly was never connected to your deepest desires, but to the desire to be admired for achieving it. You may have convinced yourself that you wanted a particular relationship, career, lifestyle, or identity because it looked impressive from the outside, while some quieter part of you knew that it did not feel alive on the inside. This is why the eclipse can feel like an ego reset. It does not necessarily destroy who you are. It challenges the version of yourself that depends on being seen a certain way. And this becomes even more significant because the lunar nodes shifted onto the Leo-Aquarius axis at the end of July. That movement means the question being raised now is not designed to disappear after one difficult week. It introduces an 18-month period in which the need for external validation can become increasingly difficult to maintain. The tension is moving between the desire to stand apart and receive recognition, and the growing awareness that your life also exists within a larger collective experience. The old question was, how can I make sure people see me? The emerging question becomes, how can I participate in something larger than myself without losing who I am? That transition can be uncomfortable because the ego does not surrender easily. If you have spent years believing that your value depends on achievement, attention, or being needed, then releasing that pattern can feel almost like losing part of your identity. You may even mistake the loss of validation for a loss of purpose. You may wonder why the things that once motivated you suddenly feel less satisfying. You may feel strangely invisible, even when other people still recognize you. But that emptiness can be part of the reset. It creates enough silence for you to hear what actually belongs to you. The movement from a look-at-me mentality toward a sense of shared participation is not necessarily gentle, and the current astrological sequence makes that transition even more intense. By the time this week arrives, the emotional foundation has already been under pressure from several directions. Venus opposing Neptune brought questions around love, value, relationships, and the fantasies you may have been protecting. Mars entering Cancer shifted your instinct toward emotional defense, safety, family, and the protection of your inner world. The solar eclipse in Leo confronted the identity you present to the world and asked whether that identity is authentic or constructed around approval. Then Monday, August the 17th, brings the point where these themes begin pressing directly against one another. Mars reaches 3 degrees and 59 minutes. Cancer, and forms an exact square to Neptune at 3 degrees and 59 minutes Aries. This is why I see this as one of the most psychologically intense transits of the entire month. A square does not create an effortless connection between two energies. It creates tension. It creates friction. It places two competing impulses inside the same emotional landscape and makes it difficult to continue pretending that both can exist comfortably without a decision. Mars wants movement. Mars wants action. Mars wants to push forward and make something happen. Neptune introduces uncertainty, ambiguity, imagination, sensitivity, and illusion. So the internal conflict can feel like having a powerful engine, while the road ahead is covered in fog. One part of you is demanding that you move, while another part of you cannot determine whether the direction you are moving toward is actually correct. You may feel impatient because you want an answer, yet deeply uncertain because you do not trust what you are seeing. You may want to confront someone, make a decision, leave a situation, begin something new, or force an outcome, while another part of you knows that the picture is still incomplete. This is where the transit can become psychologically exhausting. The pressure is not simply about whether you act. It is about whether your actions are coming from clarity or from an emotional story that feels convincing because you desperately want certainty. And before the exact square arrives, another uncomfortable adjustment is already taking place. Late on August 16th, Mars forms a quincunx to Pluto in Aquarius. A quincunx can create the sensation that two areas of life are fundamentally out of sync. You can feel that something needs to change, but you cannot immediately understand what adjustment would actually make the pieces fit. It is like repeatedly trying to make two incompatible parts connect, believing that one more attempt will finally solve the problem, only to discover that greater force does not create better alignment. This can produce a compulsive urge to control circumstances. You may push harder, explain more, work longer, demand an answer, attempt to repair something immediately, or keep trying to make a situation behave differently. Yet the more pressure you apply, the more obvious the mismatch becomes. That is why the timing matters. By the time Mars reaches the exact square to Neptune on August 17th, you may already feel drained from trying to force an outcome that has resisted you. Emotional exhaustion can become the final weakness in the structure of an illusion, because maintaining a false story requires energy. You have to keep explaining it. You have to keep defending it. You have to keep ignoring the contradictions. Eventually, there comes a point when you simply do not have the strength to continue carrying something that was never truly aligned with you. That is when the breaking point can arrive, not necessarily through a dramatic event, but through a quiet internal realization that you cannot keep pretending. In everyday life, this may look much more ordinary than the dramatic astrological language suggests. You might wake up and discover that the motivation you had for a particular goal has completely disappeared. Only a week earlier, you may have considered that goal urgent, important, even essential to your future. Suddenly, the emotional fuel is gone. You cannot force yourself to care in the same way. That does not automatically mean you are lazy, distracted, or incapable of discipline. It may mean you are finally recognizing that the goal was never truly connected to your own desire. Perhaps it belonged to a family expectation. Perhaps it was something you believed a successful person was supposed to want. Perhaps you were chasing it because you wanted someone else to be proud of you. When that realization surfaces, the emptiness can be frightening because ambition may have been part of the identity you depended upon. If the dream was borrowed, then letting it go can temporarily leave you wondering who you are without it. The same process can move directly into relationships and domestic life, especially with Mars traveling through Cancer. Family members, close friends, people you live with, and the emotional roles you occupy around them can become especially revealing. Something hidden may come into awareness. It could involve a lie or betrayal. But there is another possibility that may be even more personally confronting. You may realize that you have been performing a role within your family that nobody actually required you to perform. You may have become the rescuer, the fixer, the person who solves every crisis, carries everyone else emotionally, or keeps the entire structure from falling apart. You may have believed that your usefulness was the reason people needed you. Then suddenly, you see something different. The people you have spent years trying to save may not have needed saving in the way you imagined. Perhaps you were protecting them because being needed made you feel secure. Perhaps taking responsibility for everyone else gave you a reason to avoid confronting your own needs. That realization can hurt because it does not simply change your relationship with them. It changes your relationship with yourself. For others, the experience may appear as intense uncertainty. You may find yourself questioning what is real, what is imagined, what someone meant, and what your own mind has constructed around a situation. Your thoughts can move rapidly toward worst-case scenarios, suspicious interpretations, or emotional conclusions that feel completely convincing while you are inside them. This is where Neptune becomes especially important. Neptune does not always create deception through obvious facts. It can create confusion through emotional certainty. Something can feel so right that you stop examining it. Something can feel so threatening that you assume the feeling itself proves the danger is real. Something can feel destined, even when the evidence is unclear. Something can feel completely wrong, even when you have not yet discovered why. That is the psychological trap of this energy. The emotion arrives first, becomes powerful, and then the mind begins constructing a story to explain it. This is why the Mars-Neptune Square can become such a profound moment of awakening. You are being asked to notice the difference between what you feel and what you know, between instinct and projection, between intuition and fear, and between authentic desire and the identity you created because you wanted to be accepted. The fog does not necessarily disappear the moment you recognize it. First, you have to admit that you have been standing inside it. And that recognition is what brings us directly to the next layer of this transit. Because once you understand how Neptune can make an illusion feel emotionally undeniable, you can finally begin to see what this energy may be revealing beneath the surface. This is the point where the question becomes unavoidable, because the Mars-Neptune Square does not simply create confusion. It can make you question the emotional story you have been accepting as truth. If you have been listening to everything we have talked about and quietly thinking, "This sounds exactly like what has been happening to me," then I want you to stop for a moment and take that feeling seriously. You are not necessarily losing control. You are not necessarily falling apart. What may be happening is that your awareness is finally catching up with something you have been unable or unwilling to see clearly before. Awakening is rarely as peaceful as people imagine. Sometimes awakening feels like stability disappearing. Sometimes it feels like the carefully organized picture of your life suddenly developing cracks everywhere at once. Sometimes the first stage of becoming more honest is realizing that the thing you thought was holding you together was actually the thing keeping you trapped. What appears to be collapsing may not be your real life at all. It may be the illusion you built around it. And before your conscious mind can fully understand that difference, your body may begin communicating with you first. This brings me to the physical experience I mentioned earlier, because this is one part of the Mars-Neptune Square that deserves attention. Mars is associated with the physical body, muscular energy, vitality, strength, movement, and the impulse to act. Neptune is associated with the immune system, the pineal gland, soft tissues, and processes that are not always immediately visible or easy to identify. When these two energies meet through a hard square, the experience can feel physically draining. You may wake after what seems like a full night's sleep and still feel as though you have spent the night carrying something enormously heavy. You could experience sluggishness in your limbs, mental cloudiness, or a strange reduction in the energy you normally depend on to move through your day. You might also notice increased sensitivity to chemicals, particular foods, or the surrounding atmosphere. Some people may experience unexplained aches or allergic reactions that appear to arrive without an obvious reason. I am not saying that every physical symptom is caused by a planetary aspect, because that would be impossible to establish with certainty. What I am pointing toward is the symbolic relationship between the body and the experience of living out of alignment. There are moments when the mind can keep negotiating long after the body has become exhausted from participating in the negotiation. You can tell yourself that everything is fine while your energy continues disappearing. You can convince yourself that you should keep going while your body keeps asking for a pause. You can rationalize the same situation repeatedly, but eventually your physical experience may become impossible to ignore. In that sense, the body can become the first place where resistance reaches its limit. When the mind refuses to acknowledge that something is no longer working, the body may become the place where that refusal becomes visible. The fatigue may feel frustrating, but within the story of this transit, it can also represent a protective interruption. It is as though some deeper part of you is saying that you cannot continue spending every ounce of your energy sustaining a direction that is not taking you where you believed it would. That does not make you weak. It does not mean you have failed. It means there may be a limit to how long you can keep forcing yourself to participate in an illusion that no longer feels sustainable. If this week has left you unusually depleted, emotionally and physically, give yourself permission to respond with gentleness instead of criticism. Rest when you need to rest. Allow stillness to exist without immediately interpreting it as laziness. Do not assume that every pause means you are falling behind. Sometimes the pause is exactly what interrupts the pattern that has been exhausting you. The instinct to keep pushing may be the very habit this transit is challenging, and once you understand that, the heaviness of this period begins to reveal another side that is much more hopeful. Because the Mars-Neptune Square is not necessarily taking illusions away simply to leave you with pain. The deeper purpose within this spiritual interpretation is liberation. Consider how much energy it requires to maintain something that is not true. If you are constantly convincing yourself that a relationship is still what it used to be, you have to keep explaining away every contradiction. If you are forcing yourself to remain devoted to a career that no longer brings genuine meaning, you have to continually manufacture motivation. If you are performing an identity that does not reflect who you actually are, you must spend energy maintaining that performance every time you enter a room, make a decision, or seek approval. Most people do not realize how exhausting that process can become because they have been doing it for so long that the effort feels normal. Then the illusion begins to weaken, and at first, That can feel frightening. The emotional structure you depended upon starts disappearing. The future you imagined may no longer look convincing. The person you believed you were may suddenly feel unfamiliar. The goal you chased may lose its emotional power. That emptiness can feel like failure when it first appears, but it can also be the space created when something false is finally released. Once the dust settles, you may discover that you have more energy because you are no longer spending it holding up something that required constant maintenance. The empty space is not necessarily the end. It can become the place where something genuine finally has room to grow. This is where the spiritual idea of surrender to divine will becomes important. It does not have to mean something complicated or distant from ordinary life. It can be understood very simply. Stop forcing. Stop wrestling with every uncertainty as though you must solve it immediately. Stop trying to make the fog disappear by pushing yourself harder through it. Allow the old picture to loosen so that another picture can eventually become visible. Sometimes clarity does not arrive because you work harder to find it. Sometimes clarity arrives because you finally stop demanding that reality match the vision you were trying to protect. The emotional release connected with this process can be powerful because letting go of an illusion can still involve genuine grief. You can mourn something that was never fully real. You can miss a future that existed mostly in your imagination. You can feel sadness over the version of yourself you believed you would become. None of that makes the release meaningless. It makes the release human. And this is why the timeline after the August 17th Mars-Neptune Square matters so much within this story. If the middle of August represents the moment when the illusion begins to break, what happens afterward becomes equally important. You cannot simply tear down an emotional structure and expect yourself to immediately know what replaces it. There has to be a period of processing, release, and emotional integration. On August the 28th, there is a partial lunar eclipse and full moon in Pisces, described as the very last eclipse in the Pisces series that has been unfolding for the past couple of years. Pisces carries themes of release, surrender, dissolution, and letting go of what no longer serves you. In that context, a lunar eclipse in Pisces can be understood as a profound emotional exhale after the pressure of the earlier period. It can resemble the moment when you finally allow yourself to cry after holding everything together for far too long. It can bring forward grief that you postponed, emotions you buried because you had to keep functioning, and memories that you assumed were already finished simply because you stopped talking about them. The healing may not arrive as a neat, logical conclusion. It may come through vivid dreams, unexpected emotional waves, tears that seem to have no obvious explanation, or old memories returning for one final release. You may find yourself remembering something from years ago and wondering why it matters now. You may feel an emotion you thought you had already processed. Within this interpretation, that does not mean you are moving backward. It means the emotional weight attached to the memory may finally be ready to leave. If mid-August represents the shattering, then late August becomes the morning after, followed by the beginning of rebuilding. The experience may still be painful, but there is a difference between pain caused by resisting reality and pain caused by finally releasing what you can no longer carry. As that process clears, the movement into September can feel different. You may feel lighter, more honest, more grounded, and more aware of what genuinely belongs to you. But there is an important question in all of this. How do you move through the Mars-Neptune Square without losing yourself inside the confusion? The first thing is to resist making major decisions during the next 48 hours if you can avoid doing so. The fog is described as being thickest around the exact square, which means that something that feels completely certain in the present moment may appear very different once the emotional intensity has passed. Give yourself permission to pause. You do not have to immediately define the future because you are uncomfortable with the present. You do not have to send the message, end the relationship, abandon the project, or force an answer simply because uncertainty feels unbearable. Sometimes waiting is not avoidance. Sometimes waiting is how you allow perception to become clearer. Second, notice what begins to fall away without immediately chasing after it. If the motivation disappears from a project, observe that change instead of automatically forcing yourself to recreate the old enthusiasm. If a relationship suddenly feels different, give yourself time to understand the feeling before reacting to it. The things that dissolve during this transit may be dissolving for a reason within the spiritual framework we're exploring. You do not have to grab every disappearing thing and pull it back into place. Third, allow yourself to rest. More sleep, more water, and more stillness may be necessary than usual. Do not treat exhaustion as something you must defeat, simply to prove that you are strong. If your body is asking you to slow down, listen before demanding more from yourself. The message may be found in the pause itself. And finally, choose honesty. That is the heart of everything this transit represents. Neptune can maintain a fog when we continue agreeing to live inside it. The moment you become willing to look directly at what you want, what frightens you, what hurts, and what you have been pretending not to notice, something begins to change. Honesty can be uncomfortable because it removes the protection of the fantasy, but it also gives you something solid to build upon. You may not know the entire path yet, but at least you are no longer constructing your future on something you secretly know is false. If you have been sitting there wondering why this description feels so close to your own experience, I want you to remember that you are not alone in moving through this emotional terrain. The confusion, exhaustion, grief, questioning, and strange moments of recognition can all become part of the same larger process. I believe the person who emerges from this period can be more authentic, more grounded, and more aligned than the person who entered it, not because everything becomes easy, but because you become less willing to abandon yourself in order to preserve an illusion. The breaking may hurt now, but there may come a moment when you look back and realize that the collapse was also the beginning of change. And if you are still here with me after everything we have explored, thank you for staying through it, because that means you were willing to look deeper instead of turning away from the uncomfortable parts. If this message reflects what you have been experiencing, share what this week has felt like for you. Tell me what seems to be falling away, what feels different, and what is finally beginning to make sense. These experiences can feel deeply personal, but the process of questioning, releasing, and rebuilding is something many people are moving through in their own way. Take care of yourself as this chapter unfolds, and allow the next stage to reveal itself naturally.